seats to the Supreme Court, require term limits for justices, and require the court to impose upon itself a binding and enforceable code of conduct. Congress must assert its constitutional authority to restore balance to our system of government so as to protect and ensure liberty and justice for all. That's why I and the other co-chairs of the task force will work to get Congress to pass the Judiciary Act of 2023, which will add 4 seats to the Supreme Court, the Term Act, which will establish 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices, and the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act, also known as the CERT Act, which will impose a binding and enforceable code of conduct upon the Supreme Court, and also impose gift and travel reporting requirements the same as have to be met by House and Senate members, along with other reforms, recusal standards, for instance. So we know that the issue of Supreme Court reform is fundamental to saving our democracy, and that's why we are all here today. But not everyone in Congress knows that this is a 5-alarm fire situation, and that's why I started this task force. We need to educate other members and congressional staffers about how we got here, what the scope of the problem is, and what steps we can take to save our democracy. That's why we plan to hold briefings and brown bag lunches so that we can dig into these topics and make sure everyone in Congress understands how our Supreme Court has been corrupted and how to fix it. To fix a problem, you have to demystify it, and that's what we hope to do. And now I'm happy to pass the microphone over to my good friend and colleague, constitutional scholar and Congressman Jamie Raskin.
Hank, thank you very much. I want to salute Congressman Johnson for his leadership in convening this task force. Right now, America's got the best Supreme Court that money can buy, which is a pretty awful Supreme Court. And we need the best Supreme Court that money can't buy. So this task force is going to take a flashlight to the way that our jurisprudence has been completely warped and distorted by the Federalist Society and by right-wing dark money forces, and it's going to inspect all of the ethical lapses and violations that have come to constitute the daily bread of this court. And we are going to fight to restore the Supreme Court's integrity and to fight to recapture public confidence in the Supreme Court. But right now, it's a serious threat to the continuing work of constitutional democracy. And so those of us who are constitutional patriots in other parts of the government have got to stand up for the constitutional design and also for the integrity of the judiciary. And I get to turn it over at this point to my colleague, Representative Madeleine Dean from Pennsylvania, who was with me when we went over to impeach the former president the second time around. But everybody gets a turn eventually.
May we have not another turn at that. It was my honor to work alongside you, Representative Raskin. My name is Madeleine Dean. I'm a member of Congress representing suburban Philadelphia, Montgomery, and Berks County in Pennsylvania. I am delighted and I'm thankful that you have put together this task force. Thank you so much for everything that you have done around court reform. It could not be more important. Because Americans cannot wait to have their essential rights, including the right to reproductive freedom, the right to vote, protected from special interests. Imagine we have to say that in terms of the Supreme Court of the United States. but that's actually what has happened. I am particularly hopeful about the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act. It's a mouthful, also called CERT. Critically, this bill will put in place long overdue guardrails, a code of conduct, imagine that applies to the justices, and rules for disclosing gifts like the ones that Representative Johnson just spoke about. Egregious gifts, handouts to Supreme Court justices, oftentimes by people who have business before the court. These are common sense measures needed now to ensure that our country's highest court isn't beholden to the highest bidder. The court's bottom line shouldn't be dollars and cents. It should be upholding the laws on behalf of the United States under the United States Constitution. We aren't calling for justices to do anything we, as members of Congress, don't already have to do. I'm mindful that today is the deadline for our financial reporting. How we go over it meticulously to make sure we transparently reveal who we are, what transactions we have done, what gifts, if any, we have received. We're not asking for anything different from the justices. And it's not just us. Take a look at doctors, lawyers, teachers, journalists, engineers, police officers are all subject to codes of professional ethics. I always think back to law school when I took the course in ethics. I was taught that it was essential to maintain the integrity, the credibility as an attorney. That means avoiding even what I learned, a phrase I absolutely love, even the appearance of impropriety. It is absurd that the justices of the Supreme Court have flouted this standard without being held accountable whatsoever. This is especially true when the stakes are so high for American people and our rights. We're just weeks away from June 24th, the anniversary of the egregious Dobbs decision. I'm thinking of the great pain caused across this country when the Supreme Court overturned decades of legal precedent in Dobbs. That dark day led many women, and I'm mother to 3 sons, mother-in-law to 3 daughters-in-law. It led many women excited for motherhood to have delayed or denied treatment, sometimes resulting in infection or even the risk for their own fertility or their own lives. One ER doctor, a physician in an ER, put it this way: in this post-Roe world, women with miscarriages may die. Dobbs also stripped away people across the country a sacred right to bodily autonomy and the safety of knowing we can decide our own destiny, our own futures. Clearly, the justices of the Supreme Court wield tremendous power over our lives. But absolute, unchecked power corrupts absolutely. And sadly, that is what we are witnessing here in this great country. That is why it is essential that we restore checks and balances on the judicial branch. I believe in this task force. I feel so lucky to be one of the co-chairs on the task force alongside the folks you see here, in addition, Adam Schiff. I know that we can do more to hold our Supreme Court accountable. They make the most important decisions that affect every single one of our lives. They must be held to the high standards that every single American deserves. And so it is my pleasure to introduce a talented lawyer, a former public defender, the young woman from Dallas, Texas, Representative Jasmine Crockett, co-chair.
How I get to stand with these giants, I'm not quite sure, but definitely feel blessed. So before I was in Congress, I was a state representative in the amazing state of Texas. And before that, I was a practicing lawyer. I started my career, and early on, I was a public defender in Bowie County, Texas, which is East Texas. And none of my clients had enough money to take the Bowie County judges on private planes to Alaska or Rome. They were lucky if they could afford bail. And speaking of that, I even had clients that died in jail because they couldn't afford bail. But I'll say this, if they had, the judges, I would have asked them to be recused immediately, simply because it would be wrong. But here, across the street from the highest court in the land, there is no such expectation. In fact, taking members of the most powerful judicial body in the free world on luxury vacations is simply considered good legal practice. And unlike the cases I took on as a public defender, the outcomes decided by this court don't just impact the future of that defendant or victim. They impact the future of hundreds of millions of Americans for generations to come. So why are the ethical standards we enforce for the most powerful court in the country seemingly non-existent? The stench of corruption is almost as loud as Trump's body odor coming from the Supreme Court, and the American people can smell it. Public trust in the court has never been lower, dropping almost 30 points over the past 20 years. Under the Dobbs decision, the court overturned 50 years of legal precedents established by Roe v. Wade and ripped away women's basic rights to privacy and bodily autonomy in the process. Several justices advanced to this court by the former president and current porn star hush money fraud trial defendant known as Donald Trump were revealed to have blatantly lied to members of a co-equal branch of government as to their position on Roe in order to secure their lifetime seat on the bench. As a result, women in Republican extremist states like mine are being subjected to what amounts to medical torture, forced to endure terminal pregnancies until they're on the brink of death. Some flee the state, some risk being incarcerated, and some actually die. Doctors are fleeing these states in droves, leaving healthcare deserts in their wake. The same Republican legislators who rushed to pass these abortion bans after Dobbs are now saying, well, they didn't quite understand what all it would actually do. Yet in most of these states, they haven't moved a muscle to repeal their terrible laws. This court is supposed to deliver justice and legal clarity. How is any of this just? How has any of this chaos we've endured after Dobbs brought us anything that looks like clarity? As a lawyer and a lawmaker, I know that the American people deserve better. They deserve a justice system that is held to the same standard it expects of us, that every person is equal before the law and no one is above it. I am honored to join some of the strongest legal minds in Congress, including Ranking Member Hank Johnson of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Courts and my oversight Ranking Member Jamie Raskin, to form this task force and push towards legislation that, if passed, will end the court packing that has compromised this body for far too long. With Donald Trump on the ballot again, and election deniers and MAGA extremists flouting the law at every turn, our country is facing the prospect of a constitutional crisis. Honestly, I would argue that we are currently in a constitutional crisis. We need a court that we can trust to navigate those choppy waters if we want our democracy to survive. But I don't think this court is capable of navigating a kiddie pool right now. That needs to change. We have the legislation that can change it and strengthen the court for generations to come. I'm ready to work with my colleagues on this task force to get it done. And with that, I have the honor of introducing somebody that is my very good friend. I hope I'm going in order. I am. My very good friend. We actually met in the streets of DC, where I was just a state lawmaker at the time, and I was fighting for voting rights at the time. And unfortunately for him, he has been stuck with me ever since. That person is Sean Eldridge, the president of Stand Up America.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Good afternoon. It is always daunting to follow the great Congresswoman Crockett. As she said, my name is Sean Eldridge, and I am proud to be here to represent Stand Up America and our nearly 2 million members across the country. First of all, a huge thank you to the representatives here today, including Representatives Crockett, Johnson, Raskin, and Dean, for their leadership in launching this important task force and for gathering all of us here today. When it comes to the Supreme Court, the American people are fed up with the status quo. And we see that in poll after poll that shows historically low trust in the highest court in our land. And looking at the past few years, it is no surprise why. The right-wing majority on the Supreme Court abandoned decades of precedent to overturn Roe and end abortion access for millions of Americans. They've stood with the NRA and blocked common-sense local gun safety laws, even as tens of thousands of Americans are killed by gun violence every year. Time and time again, they side with wealthy corporations over American workers, public health, and our planet. And right now, they're helping Donald Trump avoid accountability for trying to overturn the will of the people in 2020 by delaying his criminal trial until after the election, which is an absurd dereliction of their duty to ensure equal justice under the law. All that while accepting lavish gifts from billionaires and right-wing donors, including private jet travel, tuition payments, and super yacht vacations. The right-wing majority on the Supreme Court is unaccountable, unethical, and unchecked as they attack our fundamental freedoms. The good news is that the American people are not taking these scandals and these rulings sitting down. Our members at Stand Up America have driven nearly 800,000 phone calls and emails to Congress from every single district, demanding that representatives support passing a binding code of ethics, expanding the court to restore ideological balance, and enacting term limits. And we thank the representatives here today for heeding that call, for listening to their constituents, and for leading by creating this important task force. We know that some Republicans will try to call court reform radical, but nothing could be further from the truth. No one should have unchecked power for life. That's why 49 out of 50 states already have term limits, elections, or age limits for their highest courts. Our latest poll found that a supermajority of Americans, including a majority of Republicans, support 18-year term limits for the United States Supreme Court. A Marquette Law School poll from late last year showed that 54% of Americans support increasing the number of justices on the court. And in fact, Congress has already changed the size of the Supreme Court 7 times in our country's history. These reforms are not radical. They're mainstream, they're popular, they're common sense. What is radical is the current state of the Roberts Court, including having to worry about corporate capture or whether or not a justice's vote has been bought and paid for in advance. That's why 78% of Americans want Congress to pass a binding and enforceable code of ethics. This task force is not about attacking or undermining the court, quite the opposite. It's about restoring trust and fairness and integrity, all of which are currently sorely lacking. As a co-equal branch of government, our representatives in Congress have not only the right to serve as a check on the Supreme Court, they have a duty. And that's why we urge every member of Congress to join these incredible leaders and co-sponsor legislation to enact a code of ethics, term limits, and to expand the court. And with that, I'm happy to turn the mic over to my friend, Adam Smith, Vice President of CREW.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Congressman Johnson, for the leadership that you've shown over the years in demanding a Supreme Court that is trustworthy and representative of our country today. As you said, I'm Adam Smith, Vice President at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW. At CREW, we have been a leading voice calling for judicial ethics reform for years. At a time when democracy often feels like it's hanging in the balance, we believe strongly that the courts, specifically the Supreme Court in particular, must serve as a bulwark against authoritarianism. Unfortunately, right now, as the other speakers have mentioned, the Supreme Court is in an ethical crisis of its own making. From personal conflicts of interest to influence peddling schemes, the justices have shown an unwillingness to do what it takes to restore the public's faith in their work. This is a disaster in the making, not just for the judiciary, but for our entire system of checks and balances. That's why CREW supports the Court Reform Now task force and the bills that it supports. And we are so thankful for Congressman Johnson's leadership, as well as Congressman Raskin, Congresswoman Dean, Congresswoman Crockett, and Congressman Schiff. Their unwavering commitment to restoring the public's faith in the Supreme Court and ensuring that justices are held to the highest ethical standards is critical to protect our democracy. Americans must be able to trust that the court is making decisions based on the law, that they're not being improperly influenced by wealthy interests with business before the court who are paying for them to go on all expenses paid resort vacations or trips or private jets or simply buying access through big donations to court-related fundraising groups. We can no longer wait to address the ethical rot that is eroding the foundations of our justice system. We must continue to demand a Supreme Court that is held to the highest ethical standards, and we look forward to working with the Court Reform Now Task Force to do that. Thank you. Now, Rashad Thomas at ECU, and Citizens United.
Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rashad Thomas, and I'm the Legislative Affairs Director at In Citizens United Let America Vote Action Fund, a grassroots organization of over 4 million members. We're dedicated to rooting out corruption in government and protecting the freedom to vote. I'm honored to be here alongside friends and allies to celebrate the creation of the Court Reform Now Task Force. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV. But I do have common sense, and the American people do too. They recognize that the Supreme Court has veered way off the path of ethical behavior and has imposed a whole lot of decisions that have truly deleterious impacts on their day-to-day lives. And it's no surprise that they feel this way. Time and time again, Supreme Court justices have undermined the American people and our very democracy for their own self-interest. Last summer, we watched ethics scandal after ethics scandal unravel before our very eyes. To this day, there has been no accountability for any of the sitting justices involved or their billionaire benefactors. The time for change has long passed. We desperately need Supreme Court reform, and we need it now. The Court Reform Now Task Force will be a crucial component to restoring confidence back to our highest court, and it couldn't be led by better co-chairs. Representatives Crockett, Dean, Johnson, Raskin, and Schiff are all champions in the fight for court reform. They are dedicated to ensuring our Supreme Court actually represents the American people and not the wealthy elite. It's clear the Supreme Court and their holier-than-thou attitude are unable to police themselves, and the Court Reform Now Task Force is the perfect group to stand in and do so. Their support and advocacy of key reform bills, including the CERT Act, the Judiciary Act, and the Term Act, will hold the justices to account for their actions. These bills will also strengthen the delicate checks and balances needed to keep our courts fair. The task force will not only clean up the Supreme Court, but will keep any and all justices, present and future, from ever putting their own bottom lines above the interests of the American people. The Supreme Court should be the gold standard for ethics, not the corrupt mess that it currently is. We know this task force and the co-chairs are up to the challenge of rooting out the corruption within the court, and we stand with them 100%. We look forward to all they will accomplish, and most importantly, we look forward to finally having a fair and ethical Supreme Court that looks out for the people and not for the big money special interests. Thank you very much. And now I will pass it on to Ryan Stitzline, Vice President of Political and Government Relations for Reproductive Freedom for All.
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Stitzline. I'm the Vice President of Political and Government Relations at Reproductive Freedom for All. And today I'm here on behalf of our more than 4 million members nationwide. As has been mentioned today, when the Supreme Court ended Roe v. Wade nearly 2 years ago, it opened the door to the cruel and dangerous abortion bans that Republicans have championed across this country. Already 21 states have banned or restricted abortions, and we continue to live through the fallout every day. The patchwork of legal abortion in our country means that your freedom to build the family and life that you want is determined by where you live, how much money you have, and your ability to travel. The crisis the Supreme Court created when it paved the way for these bans is horrific and unacceptable. And it's up to us to chart a new path forward and ensure that this never happens again. Our freedom to determine if, when, and how to start or grow a family remains on the line. As the Supreme Court's scandal-plagued conservative supermajority prepares to hand down decisions in 2 additional cases about abortion, it is as clear as ever that we need court reform to salvage the legitimacy of our judiciary. Anti-abortion extremists never intended to stop at overturning Roe v. Wade, and conservatives on the Supreme Court are poised to help them get their way. In fact, in his concurring opinion in the Dobbs decision, Justice Thomas even went as far as to call on the court to overturn its precedent affirming the right to contraception. And it does not stop there. All of our fundamental freedoms, including IVF, LGBTQ+ rights, voting rights, and more, are in serious danger as long as these extremist justices remain unchecked. And that's exactly why this task force is so important. We need to find real solutions to restore legitimacy of our federal judiciary and address the crises we face. We're grateful to Representatives Johnson, Raskin, Crockett, Dean, and Schiff for their leadership in bringing this task force to fruition, and we look forward to continuing to work alongside them and our partners to address the crisis of our courts and ensure reproductive freedom is a reality for all of us. And I'll now hand it over to Megan Hatcher-Mays from Court Accountability.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. Thank you to Representatives Johnson, Raskin, Dean, Crockett, and Schiff, and their wonderful staff for pulling this together today and for your dedication and leadership in addressing our completely out of control judiciary over the years and now with the launch of the Court Reform Now Task Force. My name is Megan Hatcher-Mays. I'm a senior advisor at Court Accountability, a nonpartisan organization committed to restoring the integrity of our broken judiciary, if that's possible, and building movement power to constrain anti-democratic judicial overreach and protect the rights and freedoms of all Americans, which are at risk because of the Supreme Court and many of the lower court judges who were hand-selected by Donald Trump. We at Court Accountability would like to commend the task force co-leads for taking concrete steps to address the far-right scheme that has captured our courts and dragged our constitutional rights back to the 18th century. The new Court Reform Now Task Force proves that House Democrats are fighting for fair courts and a functional democracy, even when few others will do so. At a time when a new Supreme Court scandal seemingly drops every week, as frequently as a Kendrick Lamar response. I don't know. It seems that way anyway. And when we have a sitting Supreme Court justice rejecting the very idea that Congress has the authority to regulate the court at all, it is inspiring to see fighters like the leaders of this task force plant their feet firmly and say, read the Constitution again. We have the authority and we're going to use it. It used to be the case that Supreme Court justices could kind of operate in a certain veil of anonymity, and fortunately those days are over. It turns out many, many people are deeply concerned about what's going on in our courts. The justices' behavior became too flagrant to ignore, and they unleashed a righteous wave of anger. American people started to pay attention and started to fight back against justices who spend their days stripping us of our constitutional rights and their evenings and weekends toasting themselves on fancy yachts. This task force heeds the call of everyday Americans who want this court and our judiciary more broadly to be held accountable, finally. The Court Reform Now Task Force sends a clear message that champions of democracy can do great things now, even without the gavel, although we know that with it we can ramp up these critical efforts to rein in the MAGA Supreme Court with the full powers of the committee. In the meantime, we are pleased to see this task force take off, and we encourage all members of the House, any of you, to join this cause. So thank you for fighting with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Lenita King from my good friends at Demand Justice.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Representatives Johnson, Dean, and Crockett. I'm Lanita King from Demand Justice, and we are so pleased to be here to celebrate and recognize the launch of the Court Reform Now Task Force that you, along with Representatives Raskin and Schiff, are leading. As you know, Supreme Court justices, like federal judges, are all public servants. They aren't kings or queens, they're public servants. But for far too long, the court has been allowed to consolidate power in the judiciary while acting in a way that seriously undermines the public's trust in the independence of their actions. Today's launch is an important recognition of that fact, but also serves as a critical recognition that Congress, which really means the American people, are not powerless in the face of these actions. 3 of the bills that the task force will be championing show a few of the necessary steps that Congress could take to put checks on limitless judicial power. We could rebalance the court after Senate Republicans 8 years ago set in motion a dangerous chain of events. They not only denied the American people the nominee of the sitting president at the time, but also allowed a twice impeached one-term president to appoint a full third of the court in just a matter of 4 years. Term limits regularize appointments, and by ensuring that each president would put the same number of justices on the court brings us closer to a court that is more reflective of the values of the American people. And of course, taking steps to put strong ethics guardrails in place to prevent justices from flouting the public's trust by acting in ways that no government official should be able to. These are critical reforms. We're thankful that the task force will also be lifting up additional avenues to improve our courts and the functioning of justice in America. Just yesterday, Demand Justice released new polling that showed that 88% of Americans think judge shopping shouldn't be allowed. That includes 90% of independents, 90% of Republicans, and 86% of Democrats. We hear a lot about how divided Americans are, but results like that show that the American people, on a broad bipartisan basis, are ready for Congress to check an out-of-step judiciary. So thank you again, representatives. We look forward to working with you and all of our other colleagues on this task force. And with that, I will pass it over to Tatiana Calderon from Democracy Forward.
Thanks, Lenita. Hi, my name is Tatiana Calderon. I'm the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Democracy Forward, and we are an organization that uses the law to advance democracy and progress for all people. I'm honored to be a part of the beginning of this task force and grateful to all of the members, Representative Johnson, Crockett, Dean, Schiff, and Raskin, and grateful for their leadership in advocating for a court that is worthy of our nation's trust and confidence. Their leadership in creating this task force is part of the continued recognition that the courts are central to democracy and that they are frontline in the battle for democracy. In courts across the country, including the Supreme Court, Democracy Forward has the privilege of representing people and communities that reflect every fabric of American democracy. Our clients are voters, workers, students, teachers, healthcare providers, researchers, and so many more who share the belief that the court must serve to protect and advance individual rights and democratic institutions and values that promote social justice and provide opportunities for people to thrive. Yet a constellation of highly coordinated, well-resourced extremists seek to undermine this vision of the courts by manipulating our court system as they peddle misguided legal theories and work to roll back the civil and human rights of people and try to hamstring the ability of our government to serve all people. One way they do this is by judge shopping, a practice that we've seen in this Supreme Court that undermines the health, economic prosperity, and well-being of millions of people. Whether they're seeking to restrict the access to medication abortion, to undermine contraceptive access, to erode consumer protections like protections against junk fees, to seeking to promote misinformation, extremist groups are using judge shopping techniques to peddle harmful legal theories, putting access to health care services, consumer protections, and accurate information in jeopardy. But let's be clear, as you just heard Lenita say, their tactics are unpopular with the public. They are harmful, they are extremists, and they have real negative impacts on the lives of millions. As a nation, we're facing a generationally defining moment in which what we do to uplift and safeguard the ability for all people to thrive will determine whether democracy will prevail. It is imperative that extremist movements to undermine justice in our courts are confronted and addressed, and that's why we're so grateful and encouraged by the creation of this task force, which will bring awareness to these issues and seek to address regressive attacks on our democracy in the courts that threaten the rights of people across the country. I'm delighted to be here today to join this conversation, and thank you to Congressman Johnson and all of the other leaders of this task force for continually taking up this important fight. And I have the pleasure of introducing Doug Linder, Senior Director of Judiciary and Democracy at the League of Conservation Voters.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you to all the members and speakers and to all of you for coming. I am Doug Lindner, Senior Director of Judiciary and Democracy at the League of Conservation Voters. We at LCV and our millions of members across the country know that our environmental laws need judges who will enforce them. But the Supreme Court's extreme MAGA supermajority has repeatedly shown that they will twist the law to limit climate action, roll back protections for clean air and water, gut voting rights, and open the floodgates to big polluter money in politics. When the MAGA justices don't like the reasonable protections Congress provides for our environment, our democracy, and our rights, they gut them. When the MAGA justices don't like how agency experts enforce those protections, they fabricate vague new legal doctrines, allowing themselves to tie the agency's hands. As we speak, the court is considering at least 4 different cases to upend decades of precedent and massively shift power from public interest agencies like the EPA, as well as elected officials and voters who elected them, to the Supreme Court itself. Power across every area of public policy. Power the MAGA justices can use to serve the political and financial interests of big polluters, big business, and far-right politicians, so they can reward the billionaires and extremists who helped them capture this court and who pay for their lavish vacations, so they and their friends can rule over us and roll back our freedoms for decades to come. When confronted with countless revelations of their corruption over the last year, justices like Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, as well as their benefactors, have shown not just contempt for the legitimate concerns of the American people, but also contempt for the oversight prerogatives of the United States Congress. These MAGA justices believe they can continue to wield this massive power for the rest of their lives, lawlessly advancing their personal agendas without principle, without ethics, without consequences. But the people are facing consequences. We face the consequences of dirtier air and water when environmental protections are rolled back by these same justices who have personal financial entanglements with the fossil fuel industry, who accept private jet trips and yacht trips from billionaires, who roll back voting rights, carry water for insurrectionists, sanction corporate money in politics, and pursue partisan political agendas from the bench. We cannot continue this way. The people deserve a Supreme Court we can trust, and Congress must act to deliver it. LCV proudly stands with Representatives Hank Johnson, Jasmine Crockett, Jamie Raskin, Madeline Dean, and Adam Schiff, and all the members of the Court Reform Now task force and all the supporters across the country who understand the critical need to reform our United States Supreme Court, as we fight to expand and rebalance the court with 4 new justices who will protect our environment, our rights, and our democracy instead of attacking them, to require a binding code of ethics, and to advance other reforms to ensure the nation's highest court serves the people and not just big polluters and MAGA extremists. Thank you again for coming. Next up is Mia Patel on behalf of Take Back the Court.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya. I'm a senior advisor to Take Back the Court and proud to be here on their behalf today. There's a certain irony when we talk about the Supreme Court reform these days. You'd think the justices themselves would be the biggest roadblocks to real change in our judicial system. And in some ways, that's true. They certainly don't want anything to change. And yet the justices themselves are the ones making the strongest case for why reform is so urgently and necessarily every single day. Just take Clarence Thomas. And yet the justices themselves are here doing this themselves. And so last week, as he spoke at a conference held at a swanky resort, Justice Thomas bemoaned the scrutiny he and his wife, Ginny Thomas, have been under the past year. Nastiness and lies. That's how Clarence Thomas characterized the masterful reports, exposing his failure to disclose years of luxury gifts from billionaire benefactors and the work that our leaders here in Washington have done to hold his wife, Ginny, accountable for her role in the January 6th insurrection. But let's be honest. In reality, the problem is that certain justices are not acting like independent jurists as we expect. Instead, they're abusing their immense power to enact a regressive agenda that hurts the rest of us. And that's why we're here today. We urgently need to reform this broken Supreme Court. Unless you're a billionaire who wants our country to look more like it did in the 1800s, these justices are not working for you. From quietly accepting favors from ultra donors, doling out favors themselves, or ruling against all of our best interests time and time again, these corrupt justices have gone rogue. The last couple of years, much of the justices' unethical behavior has come to light. This year, we're taking the next steps to hold them accountable. And that's exactly why the Court Reform Task Force is so important, and we're grateful to be here today. We are so grateful for the leadership of Congressman Hank Johnson, Raskin, Schiff, and Congresswoman Crockett and Dean's leadership here, because without their leadership, these voices will not be told. And so we're grateful to partner in this fight with our allies here, both groups and members of Congress, to make sure that these ethic codes and Supreme Court expansion not just have ideas and thoughts, but that they'll actually have real legs to move forward. So we're grateful, and we're grateful to be part of this team. Thank you.
Been a long journey to get to this point in this activity where we can hear from you all now. Are there any questions? And I appreciate you all's patience. Start with you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. So as we know, a lot of damage has been done to the court's credibility, as you've stated other congressional here. So do you think cert will be enough to restore Americans' faith in the court?
Well, I think passage of the CERT Act is certainly very important, but we must go further than that. In addition to a binding and enforceable code of conduct for the justices, we certainly need to unpack this court. This court is poised to do major damage to our freedom and liberty with rulings that are pending as we speak. Not to mention other cases that they have called for in deciding previous cases. They've actually telegraphed to litigants cases that they want brought before them, presenting issues that they want to decide. So these justices have been put there by a machine called the Federalist Society, which is funded by dark money special interests that have a agenda of deregulating and free market activity at the expense of everyone else, consumers, workers, small businesses. That's their agenda, and they're poised to implement it. They're implementing it right now. So we got to rebalance the court to kind of take the edge off of this extremism that exists. And last but not least, structural reform in terms of term limits, 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices. That means if the Term Act were passed today, then in accordance with that act, the first justice to be replaced automatically, well, actually, new justices appointed during the first and third years of each presidential term. So say if CERT passed, if Term Act passed today, Clarence Thomas would be off the Supreme Court in 2025, a new justice taking his place. And then in 2027, Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, would rotate off the bench after he has done more than 18 years at this point. Clarence has done 30 plus. I think Roberts has done 30 now also. after him would come 2 years later Alito, and then every 2 years thereafter would rotate a current justice on the Supreme Court off the court, so that we would have a system of nobody getting too insular, too unaccountable, too corrupt on the bench for life. We can't have that any longer. So we got to go further than cert. Cert is certainly important, but so is adding seats to the bench, the Judiciary Act, and also the Term Act to apply term limits to Supreme Court justices. Yes, sir.
So it's been almost a year exactly since cert was advanced in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and yet there's been basically no movement on it in the full chamber. So I'm curious what the task force is planning to do. Are you going to work with either Schumer and Senate Democrats to get the ball rolling on that?
Well, Senator Whitehouse has introduced the CERT Act in the Senate. I think they have actually had a hearing on Supreme Court ethics, and they have now subpoenaed Leonard Leo, and also Harlan Craft is under subpoena. So the Judiciary Committee under Senator Durbin is definitely on the trail. I think that it takes time for legislation to pass, probably more lengthy time in the Senate than it is in the House. But of course, at this time in the House, we've got to change leadership so that we can get the gavels and we can control the floor so that we can bring measures like this to the floor. And hopefully we will retain the Senate in the next election, and the Senate can press forward as it is doing. I think momentum for court reform is in our favor.
If I could, are you concerned at all that the delay in bringing CERT up for a vote speaks to reticence among Senate Democrats about this legislation?
Yeah, it does. But the efforts of the folks on, I won't call it the dais, but the folks that you're looking at up here, their efforts are very important. They are coalescing public support for the CERT Act, and I believe that they're going to be successful. And I'll if anyone wants to add anything to that, feel free. Yes, sir.
I'm curious if there's any discussion from the task force about the split process for lower court appointments. Is that something that the task force would like to see reformed? I know there's been discussion of the Congressional Black Caucus with the Judiciary Committee in the Senate to reform the blue slip process. And also, are there any conversations with the Senate Democrats about joining the task force and making it a bicameral situation?
Yeah, that is something that is on our agenda for the longer term, but for right now, we've established it in the House. I think there may be support in the Senate for a, of course, senators kind of like to do things on their own, and they, you know, so the dynamic, there's a institutional dynamic at work. Which I don't know if we'll be able to overcome the traditions that go so far back, particularly in the Senate, but anything is possible. And of course, the blue slip is a Senate process. We can certainly respectfully inquire and advise. But whether or not our advice will be heeded or not is a different question. I prefer to let the Senate work as it does, and we do have partners over there. So you know, I think things are looking pretty good. I mean, the Senator Whitehouse has a iteration of the Term Act. His legislation calls for 18-year term limits. He has introduced the CERT Act, which is the same act that we've introduced here in the House. And Senator Markey has been promoting, he sponsored the Judiciary Act, which would expand the court a few years ago. And so movement is on in the Senate, and our objective is to make sure that in the people's house we get some action going. Quite frankly, they're a little further ahead in the Senate than we are here. Yeah, one at a time or all three together. I think it's more likely that they will pass one at a time, each on their own merits, as opposed to being in an omnibus type of bill. But I've learned that you take what you can get as it comes and keep working towards your ultimate objective. Yes, ma'am.
Two questions, if you don't mind. First, do you have any plans to talk with Republicans about passing some of these bills? Clearly, there's interest within the Democratic Party, but any possibility to be bipartisan? And second, I know there was some discussion about judge shopping, but I noticed it wasn't listed in any of your lists or whatnot. Is that going to be a priority?
Yeah, we'll talk about venue provisions for district court action or trial court activities. Venue. We will. There is a problem with right-wing extremist organizations filing lawsuits in jurisdictions where they know the district court judges will grant them the relief that they seek, and so they file and seek nationwide applications for rulings in a particular court. And so that's something that we need to really take a close look at, these venue provisions and how we can prevent judge shopping. That's definitely something that we want to look at.
The partisanship issue, do you have any plans to work with Republicans on that?
Well, I mean, these three bills are open for Republican co-sponsorship, but not a single Republican has signed on to any of the three bills that are the subject of this activity today. Not a single Republican. And it's because they have the court that they want, because they're able to accomplish through the courts what they can't accomplish legislatively. And so I'm not optimistic that Republicans will want to change what they have carefully constructed over the last 45 years or so. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask, what role do you think this task force is going to play in communicating with the Judicial Conference? They've had the rule that they just put out regarding forum shopping. They've had changes to justices' gift and travel reporting rules that they put out. Do you intend on communicating with the Judicial Conference or sending people to their meetings, things like that?
Yeah, the Judicial Conference is a body controlled or led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and it's a body that I have the opportunity as ranking member on the court subcommittee of judiciary. I have the opportunity to meet with them regularly, and so they are certainly aware of the efforts of Congress people here on Capitol Hill, and it has influence on what they do without us going over there and telling them how to run their administrative operation, the administration of the courts. We oversee that administration, but we don't dictate on a day-to-day basis what they do. It's far more preferable for the court to police itself, but it has lost that ability to do so at this point. And that's why it's required that Congress step in and take some action to save our democracy and to restore this delicate system of checks and balances that our democracy depends on, that it rests on. And so we need a court that is, I mean, we've got a court, like I said, that has run amok. How can it not be amok when you're accepting free vacations every year, multiple vacations, jet travel on private jets? I mean, how can it not be amok if after you have been discovered doing that, that you turn around and then blame the people who are calling for reform, and you call out Washington, D.C. in its entirety as being pretty much corrupt? That's the problem, not you. And so that justice knows that nobody can do anything to him other than file an article of impeachment, and that's not going to result in a conviction. So, you know, these justices are not able to police themselves, and we must restore accountability. And these measures that, these laws that we are considering passing, that we've introduced, will definitely restore some accountability. Anybody want to add anything? Okay, yes, ma'am.
Hi, so I just wanted to circle back on the shopping bit. You mentioned that it's definitely something the task force will look into. I wanted to ask you what you see as the path forward for addressing nationwide injunctions, judge shopping, particularly because the reason why we have an Minnesota case is because the case was filed in the Amarillo division with the single judge that has merit here. So I just wanted to know, what is this path forward?
Well, yeah, I am not a student of this particular issue. I know it's a problem, but as a lawyer who has observed the operations of the court system, our rules of procedure, the federal rules of civil procedures specifically, to change those rules requires some delicacy, and I'm not able to speak on exactly what needs to be done in order to preserve the ability of litigants to file lawsuits in appropriate venues. I don't want to shut that down. For instance, you know, for a business litigant or a person who's been hurt by someone physically, you know, to where they are able to sue a alleged wrongdoer is of great importance, while at the same time a social activist looking for a social result on a particular issue that I might happen to disagree with, you know, where would they file their suit? So, you know, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so it has to be done carefully. We want to take a look at it, but I'm gratified that the judicial conference sees that there is an issue and is looking at doing some things internally. So there are some things that we can do, like in the case of a one-judge circuit, one district court judge in a particular circuit, to maybe tweak the rules to establish a wheel system within that particular state, that a case would have to be assigned randomly in a situation like that. So, but there again, in Texas or in any other state like California, where, you know, a district, well, no, I won't say California, but Texas, a particular district, the Western District or the Northern District, I don't know which one, but or the Eastern District may be so large geographically, and you got to account for a person's ability to travel from where they are to where the court is, and so there are a lot of things that have to be considered. We'll take one more question. Yes, ma'am.
To piggyback off the last question,
Yeah, no, I've not had an opportunity to review, so couldn't comment about it. Okay, well, that does it, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the stakeholder organizations for coming and showed up and showed out in force. You can see just with this display how far advanced the court reform effort has been and how much further it's going to go and how quickly it's going to go. And I want to thank my co-leads on this task force for their involvement and participation in it. And we'll look to do some things like this again, look for various activities and